soon. Now, through a number of parliamentary positions he holds, Labor backbencher Josh Wilson keeps an eye on foreign and security policy in many forms. We talked to him about the Middle East when he joined us here in the studio. Josh Wilson, we always appreciate you being on the program with us. Welcome back. Let's start in the Middle East. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has admitted a tragic mistake, his words, was made in the strike on Rafah that killed at least 45 people. It strikes me this is almost the exact same language that was used after the World Central Kitchen strikes as well, a tragic event, they said at the time. Is this a good enough explanation?
Well, it's not for me to necessarily judge what the Israeli Prime Minister has said, but it's a terrible, awful, horrific outcome, and it proves really what lots of people have been saying, what the Australian government has been saying about military action in Rafah. The Minister for Foreign Affairs said some time ago that that kind of action was unjustifiable and would have potentially catastrophic consequences. We made similar statements in partnership with like-minded countries, New Zealand and Canada, and the terrible event of the night before last proves that. As I've said before, you know, we need this violence to stop. What's being inflicted on Gaza is unconscionable. It's been indiscriminate and disproportionate. It can't be described as self-defence. It has to stop.
So implied in your response there, and I think in a statement Penny Wong issued last night, is, can I suggest, a degree of distrust or incredulity about the motives behind Israeli government action. So Penny Wong said Australia has been very clear that Israel must not proceed with its operations in Rafah. Now, if this was a tragic mistake, then it couldn't be allied with an operation in Rafah, could it? You actually believe, do you, that there's something deliberate about this action in Rafah that has killed at least 45 people?
Well, only to the extent that every military action is deliberate. I mean, there are choices that are made by the defence forces of any country that are deliberate, and this was something that the IDF obviously decided to do. But as we've seen, when you're approaching 40,000 civilian deaths, many of whom are women and children, it goes to that question about the legitimacy of violence that's being inflicted in that way. And you know, the Australian government has been principled, consistent, persistent and resolute in calling for a ceasefire, in saying about military action in Rafah that it would be unjustifiable, precisely because it is likely to have these kinds of consequences. When you think that we've seen the sort of wholesale destruction of Gaza, a relatively small area of land, and civilians forced and encouraged to go into a place that they understood was a place of refuge, and then they're on the receiving end of an additional bombardment, it has a predictable result. So Australia, the Australian government, the Minister for Foreign Affairs will continue to take that position that Australia should take, which is to call for an end to the violence, advocate and vote for a ceasefire at the UN when we have the opportunity to do that.
That is Australia's long-standing position. Was this most recent strike, though, in Rafah, a genocidal act?
Oh, well, look, to be honest, the use of that kind of terminology, I mean, those are judgments that ought to be made through proper processes, and I'm not sure that having people jump to certain kinds of terminology really assists deal with the substance of the issue. The substance of the issue is unconscionable suffering and violence that is being experienced by civilians in Gaza and must stop. And Australia is and should be advocating for that at every turn. But there is an issue, I think, in how we respond to it domestically, how we deal with it as a community, where we don't want to see the conversation itself, which is an important part of our democratic process, but we don't want to see the conversation and the terms of the conversation become a point of conflict where people are being pushed or judged or criticised because they're prepared to use a certain word or not prepared to use a certain word. In my view, that doesn't add to the effort.
Understood, and I don't want to get too hung up on individual words used by individual figures in public life in this country, but you'd be well aware that your junior colleague from Western Australia, Senator Payman, has used broadly that term. This is a genocide, she has said, of Israel's broader actions these last number of months, and we need to stop pretending otherwise. Do you agree with your junior colleague?
Well, I respect Fatima Payman. She is a valued colleague. I think it's great that we have the diversity of the Australian community beginning to be represented in the Australian Parliament. And if you care about democracy, you should welcome a diversity of perspectives and experiences and points of view. So I thoroughly value and respect Fatima's contribution to the conversation, but as a parliamentarian, I'm not going to shape my participation in the conversation by looking at what other people say. I'll make my own view, and I've said that about Gaza. I've said that for some considerable time. That what's happened since the turn of the year, in terms of the bombardment of civilians in Gaza, has been disproportionate, indiscriminate, unconscionable. It can't be described as self-defence. It needs to stop.
Do you support the International Criminal Court's steps towards the seeking of warrants for 5 individuals, Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, included among them?
Well, I support those institutions. I think that's something we really have to hold on to. The fact that the Leader of the Opposition has been prepared to suggest Australia would withdraw from those institutions altogether and effectively abandon the rule of law internationally was really quite bizarre. I support the institutions. I don't think people should rush to sort of form their own shadow judgments about how those institutions make decisions, but we should absolutely respect them. And people should remember that it was only a few years ago, under the former coalition government, that the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Julie Bishop, was hopeful that the ICC and the ICJ might be the means by which we would seek justice in relation to the terrible MH17 disaster. And yet, at the moment, you've got the Leader of the Opposition, who would like to think that he could occupy the position of Prime Minister of this country, seriously saying that Australia should walk away from those critical institutions of the rule of law on which we depend and from which we benefit.
Yeah, these are testing times, and I'm sure we'll talk further about events in the Middle East just as the world is right now. Josh Wilson, just another matter that you're very familiar with. We have come to understand today that the creation of a parliamentary committee with expertise and good access to classified information, it will be coming. Legislation will create it very shortly. Why is that necessary?
Well, it just improves the quality of parliamentary involvement in and scrutiny of defence and military decision making. I mean, a lot of those decisions, particularly the most serious decisions that are made, are the prerogative of the executive, and the Parliament is not as involved in those decisions as it is in respect of passing legislation, say. And so looking at ways to improve how we think about, understand, examine and scrutinise defence and military decision-making is a good thing. And the creation of this committee is actually a really big step forward. It follows from a committee process, the War Powers Inquiry, which I was glad to be part of, chaired by my brilliant colleague Julian Hill. And one of its key recommendations was the formation of this committee, which will definitely improve parliamentary involvement in scrutiny and understanding and oversight of defence decision-making and military decisions.
We'll talk further about that, and we'll look out for the membership. And very finally, the fulfilment of almost your career-long work around live sheep exports. I think some legislation coming soon to lock down the government's commitments to wrap it up.
Not to feed any impression that my career in any way is reached its culmination, but no, I'm glad about that. I mean, and I think everybody is, frankly, really. Irrespective of what your position on the trade is, it's great to have that kind of clarity and decisiveness, and with it a transition package, so that an industry that has declined by more than 90% already and has always involved animal welfare failures can come to an end on the 1st of May 2028 through further transition to more higher value, higher jobs chilled and frozen box meat exports.
We've spoken at length about that before. I will continue to describe it as the fulfilment of your career aspirations thus far, Josh Wilson, but not completely. Let's see how that legislation travels through the Parliament. And thank you once again.
Thanks, Greg.